Welcome to AWN's webinar on disability justice, decolonization, and climate justice. I'm Jennifer Natalya Fink, she, her, hers pronouns, a white middle-aged woman in a red hat and scarf. I'm director of the program in disability studies at Georgetown University and author of All Our Families, Disability Lineage and the Future of Kinship. I am delighted to be and honored to be moderating tonight. Thank you to Nancy Yang and Lydia X.Z. Brown for organizing and inviting me. AWN is based on the unceded and occupied traditional lands of the Jewere, Otoe, Missouri tribe, Pare, Pawnee Nation, and Okethi-Sakowin, Ihanktowan, Ihanktowana, and Lakota peoples. I am actually speaking to you from glamorous Gaithersburg, Maryland, which is Piscataway territory. In the present, I invite you to take a moment, if you haven't done so already, to Google whose land you are on, wherever you are. All you have to do is literally put in Google, whose land am I on? So now you can't unknow that. I personally kind of hate it when some white lady in, let's say, a weird hat gets up and makes this kind of virtue signaling proclamation without any action. So let's turn this statement of fact into a call to action, a call to restorative justice for Nacotchtank, Piscataway, and all BIPOC people. I invite you to join me in that work. And I'm going to put in the chat, Nancy, if you could put these links in the chat, some starting places. And there are lots more to take action. And I invite you to help us do the hard and creative work of making a more just and equitable community here at AWN and in the world, in whatever worlds you're in. And many of you are already doing so, and I have a lot to learn from you. A note about captions. To view captions, you may click CC and then choose to show subtitle or view full transcript. If you choose show subtitle, you can click and drag to move the subtitle on your screen. You can also access captions in a separate window. And those directions will be in the chat momentarily. Please join us on Twitter. Those hashtags, I'm not going to do a dramatic reciting of, but they're going to be in the chat as well. And we welcome you to share where you're zooming in from today and what brings you to today's webinar. You can chat to just panelists or panelists and attendees by selecting the appropriate option in the drop box. Now to the main event. I am honored and delighted to introduce our panelists. I'm going to read the introductions in order, and then each will present, and then we'll have a lightly moderated conversation. Please, I have some questions for them, but feel free to put your own comments and questions in the chat. Khairani Baroka is a disabled Minang-Javanese writer and artist in London, with work presented widely internationally. She goes by Okka, and among Okka's honors, she was in a UNFPA Indonesian Young Leader Driving Social Change and Modern Poetry in Translation's Inaugural Poet in Residence. Currently UK Associate Artist at Delfina Foundation and Research Fellow at University of the Arts, London. Her most recent book is Ultimatum Orangutan, published by 9 Arches in 2021, on the colonial nature of environmental and disability crises. Our second presenter is Dr. Sarmistha Talukdar, who is a human trying to learn every day how to navigate life with more than human beings and fellow human beings. And our final presenter is Jen Deerinwater. Jen Deerinwater is a bisexual, two-spirit, multiply disabled citizen of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma and an award-winning journalist and organizer who covers the myriad of issues her communities face with an intersectional lens. Jen is the founding executive director of Crushing Colonialism and a Disability Futures Fellow. Jen's work has been featured in a wide range of publications, including Rewire News, In These Times, and the anthology Disability Visibility, First-Person Stories from the 21st Century. Jen is the co-editor of the anthology Sacred and Subversive, Queer Perspectives on the Future of Religious and Spiritual Communities, and is currently hard at work on her own book, which we all can't wait to read. While raised in rural areas of her nation's reservation, Oklahoma, and in rural Texas, and a nomad at heart, Jen currently lives on occupied Piscataway land known as Washington, D.C. So I will turn it over to Okka.
Hi, thank you so much, Jennifer, and thank you to MJ and to Lydia, Nancy, everyone behind the scenes. It's a real honor to be speaking today with Jen and Sarmistha. So I'm going to share just a few slides. This sort of show works of mine that have combined disability justice principles with the environmental justice principles that are already in them. So this book, Indigenous Species, is a poetry art book, and it's about, no spoilers, but it's about a young Indigenous girl in Indonesia who's been kidnapped and is taken upriver. And as she's trying to escape and trying to figure out how to escape, she's also really stressed out by the environmental damage that's gone on around her and to her communities. I made sure that Tilted Access Press, the publisher, has been marketing this as a cited version. So if you go on their website, it says cited version, and then there's 2 different accessible PDFs as well. And then on every left-hand page, I put quote unquote fake braille to kind of show people reading the cited version, like this should be accessible. Why isn't there more stuff that's accessible? So an image from this page really shows kind of the tenor of the book. I bet you from the raucous machinery I'm hearing and the smell of rashness that this is where the grease deals are siphoned into miners' food, and where they're packing down eons of intricacies and strength from the forest to molecular form on a woman's lipstick bottle in Iowa. Indonesia is the world's largest producer of palm oil, which is incredibly destructive, not only to wildlife, but also to hundreds and hundreds of thousands of indigenous peoples who have died as a result of forest fires, etc. This is a recent project called Molecular, in which these are collages. So I made 5, and each is described with a poem. And this one is called Earth. And basically it's an orange backdrop with sort of a green node and like a dangling node that leads to the words "I map my station." But it's a collage because all the pixels here are actually manipulated pixels that come from news photographs of land that is either owned by or otherwise affected by people who have been contributing to the genocides of COVID-19 pandemic handling in the UK, in Indonesia, and elsewhere. So, for example, you have the Drax estate here in Barbados, somewhere in these pixels, which is owned by Drax, who is a conservative politician who really contributed to the worsening of the genocide. And so it was playing with this notion of hidden, because people kept telling me, oh, disabled deaths in COVID are hidden. And it's like, hidden for whom? They're very clear. So I'm going to read to you now from my book, Ultimatum Orangutan, or Ultimatum Orangutan. It's a bilingual title in English and Indonesian. On the front cover, there's a photograph in which you can see in purple, and that's my mom's homeland of Tanah Datar in West Sumatra, and we are Minang people. So I'm just going to read from that now. Okay. This first poem is called Time Machine. Big Ben unfolds towards me, Chimes once another gong, and the bones feel it insipid. Empire, it pummels into us residents of Simon Lodge at St. Thomas's Hospital. Empire, echo, echo, heals you and causes flexible hurt. Empire bombs just so far enough, root cause swept sideways, canals of pain a labyrinth, persimmons brought to a man here, visitor proffered, cauterizing the ache with truth, honey love, sustenance, persistence, hurt fruit. Ease guilt at living on this little isle and none of the two you came from. This the biggest pain center in Europe, your medication too dear in Jakarta. Circular logic, pain apothecary here, pain apothecaries there in felled rainforest. Every pain you felt caused by a not here. Not here understanding by science, nor the other kind, not here consistency, not here generosity of an imagined coherent universe. Eating gluttonous systems alive is entwined with their habitation. History is now, is that enough to spur self-forgiveness? Eat what is given of the old growth sucked away from your grandfather's land. Notice the eyes of a child brim light as the fountain outside churns its undying spectacle. Sort your clothes on the hangers, thank the orderlies. Take care not to miss the giant bell ding-donging dinner. This next one, and the last one I'm going to read, is a longer poem, and it is the titular poem, Ultimatum Orangutan. Just going to try and share the text here so you can see how it's laid out if you're sighted. Ultimatum Orangutan. The original King Kong story was set on an island off Sumatra, perhaps Nias. So this is twisted phobia of what is now Indonesian man and fear of his usurping of his big hairy hands on a blonde ingenue on the needle of white capitalism, the empire state building. I understand visual chimp language. I know what KK was trying to say in every edition of that film. Naomi Watts might not have understood, but for years I was obsessed with a painting of a young brown child next to a monkey by abuser Gauguin, and have stared many hours at that monkey as stand-in for some kind of brown masculinity, cowed, domestic, speaking across the years, transcending forms of visual media, asking King Kong softly, what is this world we were drawn into? I'll tell you, small animal, a world where for decades, small children under a red and white sigil were lullabied, women's rights and labor organizers were sadists, did unspeakable things, dancing sexily in their communist gear, killed the generals like animals, instead of being told, generals organized a genocide of people suspected of communism. Likely millions of people ended who were simply feared of usurping, remember the film, rounded up for no master other than bloodthirst, gentle artist among them who drew their last in 1965-66. Rewind, perhaps not no master. Ultimately, nobody's real uncle by the name of Sam sanctioned/planned all of this to open up lands with giant forklift hands, letting millions of bodies fall to the ground as it was all lifted into another country entirely. People's homes and cosmologies and rainforest lifted and dropped into the laps of people who cannot pronounce us, and only the most powerful of those who can, who claim to be of us. And so many wrestled this machinery with lives paid for so very long. Marcina at 24 are many of self, but the sigil fist. But the red and white, the red and white and blue, it caved us and caved us and caved us. Many forced to drink from it, and many said tidak, no. And every year, G30S, 30th September, they'd show the violent film recreating supposed mutiny, images of blood that snapped our childhoods in two. When I speak to people about palm oil plantations as devastation of Papuans, Dayak, Padang et al., invariably the words palm oil make them think of orangutans. We need to save them. I found myself thinking orangutans and so many peoples as well, but this phrase does not fit well on campaigns against palm oil. And whenever I see a billboard with an orangutan on it campaigning against palm oil, I say, yes, I say, is this what it takes? And always I say, and so many peoples as well. Is it any coincidence that King Kong's shown up so much with animals extinct rising again? Brontosaurus, Triceratops, Tyrannosaurus, other twisted notions of the other crafted into scales and claw. And I think about a child so small, so sad, fearful to breathe from all the blood in the air, adult nightmares seeping into her sky and her books and her friends. And just now, I remember being her and being her. And I'm thinking about Donkey Kong as a Super Smash Bros. Character and what color the thread is between the child and the pixelated animal who pounds the earth and a piece of electronics made with metals forged from this earth. And all through the making of these things, the monkey on screen, the small sad girl, and the screen she refused to open her eyes for futilely as the story would seep into the school days of her and her friends. There are our words communicating to all the sentient fellow beings who were placed on this earth gingerly and asked to go forth in it as though this were not a frightening thing, as though this very act of going forth did not require a shipful of warm glow around us in order to survive. And how we wish for this freight cargo every day, creating it, preserving it with oral literatures they can't touch or feel, with herbal medicines we try to protect from pharmaceutical gloves, with every day a ticking towards the end of glowing, the end of holding another who could be person, who could be old growth rainforest, who could be King Kong and his tears, who could be Papuan men writing white letters on themselves in jail to display for their trial at which they're accused of treason against Indonesia. That say monyet, which means monkey, which is what evil in some calls good in others when it wants to let us know this earth is taken in their movie of the present. When the earth is yours, it is yours, 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 dear protesters, Merauke to Sabang, tears when courtrooms when witnessed by none. Is yours, glory humans, yours, my dear. Sayang semuanya, all dear Lord. Ya Tuhan, tanganmu, your hands, tanahmu, your earth, milikmu are yours. Setiap hari, each day, nafas, breath adalah doa, is a prayer yang mengungkapkan, which conveys ultimatum kami semua persetan. Ultimatum, ultimata from all of us, damn it all. Dari semua manusia yang muak dan bergelora dalam amarah, yang masih bisa tertawa antar sesama setiap saat. From all humans who are sick of it and are reveling in rage, who can still at any time laugh among ourselves. Dan juga ultimatum dari semua yang mereka bakar. And also ultimatum, ultimata from all they burn, burned, will burn. Juga dari orang hutan. Also from orangutans. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Amazing, amazing. We'll move right on to Sarmistha.
Hello. I think Nancy is going to share a video of one of my performances that's pre-recorded.
This is Nancy. Just a moment while I get it up.
So this is a recording that I made with one of my disabled friends during the pandemic. I hope you enjoy this little piece.
easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of ableism.
Beautiful, amazing. We'll pick up on that provocation. Finally, Jen Deerinwater.
Hi, Osio, this is Jen. I am feeling a bit under the weather, so I'm keeping my camera off tonight. Wow, those are hard acts to follow. So I'm a journalist, and typically the work that I do is more sort of journalistic in nature and a little less artistic, but I decided tonight to kind of do a mix of both. And so I wanted to show a couple of photos and then read a poem that I wrote. So let's see. All right, so I'm sharing my screen now, and you all can see, correct? Yeah, yes. Okay. Okay, so these photos in this poem I wrote are from my time at COP26, which was held in Glasgow, Scotland in November. So COP stands for was the Conference of Parties, I believe, but it's the United Nations large annual conference on climate change. And so I went for a couple of days this year, and it was my first time going to a COP. So I wasn't entirely sure what to expect. Some of my worst and best, concerns and intentions, I feel like, were met. There were a lot of really amazing people there. So just this first photo I have up. So I tried to stay with the Indigenous bloc during the big march that happened on the Global Day of Action. So most of the photos I took are from that particular bloc, just, so folks know. So this first photo is a group of Indigenous relatives from the South, from what they call Abayala, which is the Indigenous word for what we know as the Americas. And so it's there's a big group of them, some wearing traditional clothing regalia, holding a sign that says colonialism caused climate change. Indigenous people are the solution. I just really love this photo. I feel like it kind of says it all. Sorry, I'm having some issues with my slideshow, so it's going to be a little less pretty in the way it all moves along. All right, so this next photo here, I'm sorry, I think you all are seeing the Zoom screen. There we go. So this next photo is, I got in front of the Indigenous bloc as we were marching. And so it's taking in a kind of an urban governmental area of Glasgow. And there's a big sign that says climate justice equals land back. I think that's going to be a recurring theme of all of our work and our message today is that, you can't have climate justice and colonialism. The two just don't go together. There's also a sign being held in the background that says no net zero. And that's really important because one of the big things that the climate criminals really talked about at this COP was doing net zero. But net zero it's an industry hoax. It's not actually a solution to the climate crisis. So this next photo is, it's from some relatives from the Indigenous Climate Action, which is an organization working on Indigenous climate issues and up in so-called Canada. And so one of them is holding a drum and they're wearing some traditional regalia. And so up in Canada, they're really suffering all kinds of different extraction issues, and pipelines are a big one. And there's a really strong Indigenous movement there to fight for land back and against pipelines and the Canadian and provincial governments up there and their harm to the environment and to the Indigenous people and sovereignties. And then here's a photo here of another Indigenous water protector. This was one of the only people I saw in the march who is visibly disabled. She had this particular person has a cane, and so they put her in like a little pedicab so that she could go along in the march, and still be there. And I thought that that was really wonderful and something that I really should have seen a lot of at this march. There should have been a lot of disabled people there. Out of all of the different affinity groups and blocks that were at COP, countering, COP26, there wasn't a disability group. There was no conversation of disability justice. It was completely erased from the entire counter narrative to what was going on in the COP negotiations, which was really disheartening when you consider the unbelievably high rates of disabilities that Indigenous people have, both within the so-called US and on a global level. And much of that is related to colonialism. So this next photo that I want to show, maybe if it'll open, there we go. So I'm going to show you this one, and then I'm going to move on to my poem. So this was just towards the end of the march, as we were like leading the march into the area where there was a big rally and there were speeches and performances and things. Something I really want to point out, because this happens every time I go to any kind of climate march. The Indigenous people are supposed to lead the way. We're supposed to be together. Yet the white people always push their way through. And even when they're repeatedly told it's an Indigenous only space, not only do they not listen, but sometimes they even argue with us and make excuses as to why we should allow them to go in front of us. So this area that I'm photographing, that should be all Indigenous people going through there, but a lot of that is white people that just push their way in front of the Indigenous bloc, which is very upsetting. As I said, we have high rates of disabilities amongst Indigenous people, but also 80% of the world's biodiversity falls on Indigenous lands, and much of that is in what we call, or what is known as, Latin America. So really, for me, climate justice, defending the earth, means that we have to defend, Indigenous rights, tribal sovereignty, and we have to fight for the rights of disabled and chronically ill people. Otherwise, we really are dooming the planet in a variety of ways. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn off my screen right now, and then I'll just read this poem that I wrote. Okay. So I occasionally write poetry. It's not what I publish. It's not what I'm known for, but I thought I would try to process some of my thoughts and feelings from COP26 in a different way than usual. So I hope you all like it. So this is called the old world. We don't need your queen, Siam declared. I hit my red drum, gifted by an Anishinaabe elder in appreciation. What better place for it to sing but in the lands of the OG colonizers, who never ended their theft of indigenous lives with their greed. Do you know when Greta comes on? Asked the older white lady next to me. Hard truth spoken in her white face. Indigenous, Black, brown, campesinos, urban, impoverished, and dying by white hands. But only white faces, white solutions are valued by the green. Marching through the rainy streets of Glasgow, we declared colonialism caused the climate crisis, but disabled voices, disability justice were conveniently left out. COP26 inaccessible, disabled reps left to the street, denied entrance, or left in pain while giving voice to crip climate needs. The countering left saw the truth, the lies, the presence of climate criminals, absence of those from countries most impacted by the G7, conveniently excluded through G7 created vaccine apartheid. The left held up a mirror, oppression exposed, but they excluded their disabled comrades. They left us behind, as we were left behind to die from Katrina, East African droughts and famines, failing Texas grids, PG&E power cuts, the rising waters swallowing up Polynesian lands. We didn't cause this catastrophe, but we bear its burden. Abled fingers pointed our way for the use of straws, medications, inhalers for our very existence. The greens playing into the hands of dirty energies, blah, blah, blah. Go green, personal responsibility will save the planet, they drone on, shifting blame while they pillage the earth. I limped along in pain, armed in my ribbon skirt, demanding land back. With camera in hand, I documented, telling the story of colonialism, imperialism, ableism, hypocrisy. I beat my drum, sending shockwaves of dreams and demands for justice back to the earth. All right, so Wado, thank you. I hope that you all enjoyed that. And I have a lot more photos from Glasgow, from COP26 that I'll be posting on my Instagram account over the next few weeks. And that's at Jen Deerinwater on Instagram. Wado, thank you.
Thank you, Jen, and thank all three of you for those powerful and completely different and yet intersecting in some really interesting places. I thought I'd start by asking you each to talk a little bit about maybe what your piece means to you and maybe what you hope it opens up about disability justice, decolonization, and climate justice that you feel kind of maybe is buried or underrepresented or misrepresented in either disability justice conversations, climate conversations, decolonization. So why don't we start with Okka? And any piece of that that speaks to you, what it means to you, where you see your work taking the conversation in a different place than we've heard it before.
Yeah, thank you so much to Sarmistha and Jen. I think it's just really wonderful to hear people say things like net zero is an industry hoax, like out loud. There's a whole ton of ecofascism in the UK. A lot of ecofascism. And I have been on panels with people saying, oh, this whole industrial revolution stuff is, it was for the quote unquote common good. Again, as I mentioned, there's a lot of focus on wildlife preservation, but I recently met a journalist saying, oh, when the forest fires of 2015 happened, which by the way, killed nearly 100,000 people, mostly indigenous inhabitants in Indonesia alone, I only covered the orangutan deaths. And I've heard from other journalists as well that like for the West, you need to cover orangutan deaths. Or I forgot to say earlier, but orangutan is actually a word, a compound word from Indonesian. Orang means person or people, and utan means forest. So when we talk about orangutans, we're literally saying orangutan, they're also peoples of the forest, right? Like us. But then we are treated as subhuman. And orangutan deaths are elevated when indigenous peoples are the biggest protectors of orangutans, as evidenced by us calling them peoples of the forest. So it's an uphill struggle, and it's very difficult to convince people. So it's just really nice to have collectivity in this room.
And I think by taking that one instance of it, of the orangutan and sort of the fetishizing of the animal over the human and the way that plays into this colonialist narrative, it's one of those sort of the world in a grain of sand, it opens up the whole conversation through the specificity of that. So I found that really complex and powerful and amazing. So thank you for that. Let's see, over to Sarmistha.
Hi, Jen. Regarding my piece, there are a couple of things that I want to talk about regarding the piece. One of the first things that I want to talk about is the work is like, I try to incorporate multiple fields whenever I'm making art. So it's not always just art. It's always either art along with science and some forms of aligning my values in the form of expression. So one of the things that I did was I tried to convert the bioelectric impulses of a endangered plant that I planted in my backyard. It's called Silene regia. It's native to the East Coast and Virginia and surrounding areas. But but like all endangered plants, it's not doing well. It's not doing well. It's dying in many places. It's getting displaced from its native habitat by invasive colonizing plants, which like kind of mirrors what is happening in the human realm as well. It's like how climate justice and disability justice, they are like very much in parallel in that way that like we have this climate change happening, one of the biggest mass extinctions happening. And in the human realm, we have the COVID-19 happening and disabled people are just left to die. It's like, it's just like human values. Where are the human values? Like, why can't we protect lives, be it, disabled in any way? The endangered plants, they are disabled to fight against the colonizing plants and the disruption that the white people have been causing and settlers have been causing over the land. And then like how those parallels are interconnected and interdependent too. So I tried to show that also through the sound of using climate change data. So basically what I did was I looked back almost, I think, 30 years of climate change data from the Hindu Kush Mountains. So it's a mountain in Asia. I know a lot of people talk about climate change. They focus on like Paris drowning and like all this white colonial spaces drowning or again being affected by climate change, but people don't really talk about how the global south is like already impacted. So Hindu Kush Mountains, the glacier is already melting at a pretty high rate. And that's causing a lot of, it had started already causing a lot of damage to the humans and non-humans that live in the southeastern continent. So there are like, I think 9 countries affected by the melting of the Hindu Kush glaciers. For example, India, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, Nepal. Tibet, Pakistan, Afghanistan, these surrounding areas will be affected and are already being affected. Like, for example, Sundarbans in Bangladesh and India, they are like, getting submerged more and more. And who are the most impacted there? The indigenous people who live there, the Dalit people, the Bahujan people who live there, who were displaced due to partition of India. They are the ones who are the Damshudris. They who were displaced from Bangladesh thanks to the colonizers who divided our country and Hinduism. They are the ones who are like suffering. And again, amongst them, who are the most impacted? The queer and the queer and disabled folks amongst them. Like the margins, people at the margins of the margins are always the ones who are the ones who are most affected. And I feel that's reflected in the landscape of Earth as well. So what I did was, for that piece, was that I took the climate change data from 30 years and I arranged it and converted it into sound to create this ominous. I hope it sounded ominous. I think it sounded ominous. I don't think it sounded pleasant. So it's like create this ominous soundscape, and to like convey how much pain there is, not only in like the sound, the data itself is so ominous, but like I hope to like translate that as how much pain there has been in the land and the beings who are on the land, marginalized by different areas. I think a lot of this work is influenced by a lot of the work that indigenous people in India, as well as all in US, in Turtle Island, have been doing. And some of this work is also influenced by Sunana Taylor, who has been talking a lot about how the parallels and the connections between disability justice and climate change. So I will stop there.
It's so layered, what you're doing. It's really complex and powerful. And that legend superimposed at the end kind of reframes if we did fall into the sort of over aestheticizing trap, right, of the beautiful flowing, that I thought,
I feel like the last line that I wrote was, is it easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of ableism? I feel like it's very, considering what CDC very recently talked about, is like very time appropriate for now, like how CDC is like, oh, disabled people are going to die. It's encouraging. So it's like, it's easier to imagine the end of the world and imagine the end of ableism. People would rather have disabled people die. People would rather have disabled plants, which is like endangered plants die, endangered species die. They would rather prefer these die and over like this capitalistic colonial world survives over everything.
Just to sort of add to that, if I may, just a little bit, is like, I also really think that in terms of imagining the end of ableism before the end of, imagining, the end of the world before the end of ableism or the end of capitalism, the use of indigenous plants and herbal medicines as, like for the common good, when they're being stolen from people or burned away, and then marketed by these pharmaceutical giants, shows like these pharmaceutical giants are who you're putting, the fate of this like extremely precious indigenous knowledge in, and what Jen was talking about, the net zero initiatives, carbon credits, a lot of that is allowing indigenous lands to be sold to companies through the back door, sometimes through the front door, companies like Shell and companies like pharmaceutical companies. So I think that the whole common good narrative is sometimes so damaging, and it just shows in how medicine distribution is. I'm
in the medical field, so it's terrible. I not sometimes, but many times I feel ashamed to be in the medical field, because it's terrible. And like healing practices are just basically biopiracy practices, if I can sometimes narrow it down. So thank you, Okka, for bringing that up. You're like, everything is so complex, and we can talk about this like forever.
I want to bring Jen in, but in Brazil, Bolsonaro, part of how he sold the burning of the Amazon was, to make hospitals and housing on indigenous land that's used for indigenous plants and medicines. That was part of the sell, right? Jen, jump in, and if you want to talk a little bit more about what your piece means to you, and particularly you mentioned you don't usually write poetry, and you were sort of moved to include the poem in the sort of photojournalist piece, and I'd love to hear a little more about that.
Well, I love to pair words with some sort of image. I think they're obviously both very powerful on their own, but I like them together. And I think sometimes, especially with photography, like protest photography and such, like political actions, I think sometimes the story of what's going on that's not in the shot is sometimes even more interesting than what you actually get a good photograph of. Because it's, like I also do a lot of landscape and nature stuff, and they're two very different types of photography. But for COP26, like I mostly took November off. I decided this Native American Heritage Month, I'm going to take some time to myself and rest. So I decided, like I had thought about writing a piece on COP26 and what I saw while I was there and publishing something, but I just felt like I wanted to honor my time off as much as I could. So, I took my camera gear, took some of it with me, took some photographs, and I was like, hey, I'll get around to editing those like 2 weeks ago. So it was doing more of a poem and some photography for this, actually in a way was also me honoring my own like disability needs, just kind of like tonight, rather than forcing myself to like put on makeup and look quote nice or professional and smile for a camera when I'm in a lot of pain. Instead, I'm like, I'm just going to do this from the comfort of my bed tonight. And I got a little off track there. I tend to ramble sometimes. But COP26, yeah, I have a lot of great photographs from it. And I think part of the reason I also decided to do a poem tonight is because I'm still trying to process my way through everything that I saw there and what came out of it. And, it in the poem where I talk about the lack of access, I think it's really important to point out that the ableism was both within COP26 itself, which is a United Nations thing, but it was also present within like the counter protesting of it, so like the COP26 coalition, for example, like all of the organizations and people from around the world that came together who knew the COP26 was going to be, sadly, most likely a bunch of nonsense. Like that was the group where like you have an indigenous block, you have this block, you have that block, but there was no disability block, no disability justice narrative, nothing. It was really frustrating and very, very upsetting. And so I wanted to point that out, just like I wanted to point out the implicit racism within, the Greens, the environmental people. It's funny when Okka mentioned how, the West likes to hear about the orangutans and not the people that are being harmed by palm oil. I was like, oh yeah, that sounds about right. They'll donate money for animals, but they're all too happy if people die. It actually, kind of brought to mind, like I said earlier, Indigenous people have some of the highest disability rates in the world. In my research so far, from what I have found, some of the highest rates are actually in Nepal, and it was like a little over 50% of Indigenous people in Nepal had disabilities. And so much of that is tied to colonialism. And, it's frustrating as well. I touched on vaccine apartheid, um, because that's a huge thing. If the West, if the G7 countries, which the G7 are the world's 7 wealthiest countries, basically, um, it's basically their fault that we don't have a much more vaccinated global populace in terms of COVID-19. Like, there are estimates that it could cost only $50 billion to vaccinate the world. Meanwhile, the 2021 US military budget was $753.5 billion.
Oh, that's so obscene. It's just so
Yeah.
obscene.
And the US military is actually the world's largest polluter as well. So, I think it says a lot, and when I was at COP26 and when I try to talk about these things, to international audiences, I always feel conflicted as an Indigenous person, because I'm like, well, that part of my family didn't choose to be American. That happened to us, and it happens to us every day. But I also understand that I am a citizen of a country that's doing mass devastation across the world, whether it's through pandemics, which we know are very closely tied to climate crisis, or it's just through pipelines or wars or whatever it is the US government is doing. And I think what we've seen with the CDC and then Biden talking about the economy recently, it really does bring to light that, capitalism, which is a symptom of colonialism, is ultimately going to kill us. So for me, the way to work towards solving the issues of ableism and the climate crisis and such is to get rid of colonialism. That for me is just ultimately the only way.
Well, I think all three of your works really powerfully demonstrated how, we often talk about disabling conditions, but really concretely linked them to colonialism in ways that are both incredibly particular and global. And I think through sort of the aesthetic framing that you all did, those connections were made really deeply in kind of new and exciting ways. So I want to open things up to the audience, see if there are any questions from the audience on the chat or the Facebook or anywhere. And I think if not, or if we're waiting for questions, I think, somebody just jumped in. Great. Does anyone have reading recommendations? Oh, you definitely are going to get some reading recommendations from these three around the intersection of colonialism, climate change, capitalism, and disability. Well, I would say Jen's work to start with, for sure. Other suggestions from any of you? Just unmute yourself and jump in if you have suggestions. And the person also, Kelly Mack, is the questioner, also said, thank you for this wonderful talk. And I want to thank MJ, our wonderful interpreter, who kept up with my horrible New York speedy slurred speech. Thank you for that. Before I forget. Thank you, MJ. So any reading recommendations on the relationship between these issues, their intersections and connections?
I would say, oh, sorry.
Oh, that's okay. I was just gonna say, I don't know of any books off the top of my head that cover those intersections, but one that I just recently picked up that I haven't read it yet, but it looks really interesting. It's by Aja Barber. It's called Consumed: The Need for Collective Change, Colonialism, Climate Change, and Consumerism. And she talks a lot about fast fashion in it. And I'm really interested to see how she ties all those things together. And when I've heard Aja speak, she also ties in fat phobia as well, which makes me wonder how you could also apply, a decolonizing of disability lens to this book. But yeah, I'm eager to hear other people's suggestions.
Yeah, I think in terms of books, I'm a huge fan of Leanne Betosamosake Simpson. Her books, her music, her poetry, and in terms of Indigenous media, also look to like journalists like Jen and other, like actual Indigenous media networks. Just to share a small anecdote. So I once had a white Australian woman say to me, like, where are the Indonesian voices against environmental destruction? I haven't heard of any. And then I think of how, family members were literally getting tear gassed at environmental protests that were framed by Australian media as quote unquote sex law protests, because during those particular protests, the Reformasi di Korupsi protests, the students had 10 points that they were protesting, one of which was against the omnibus law, which sadly is, coming to be ossified in Indonesia. And this new omnibus law basically allows for even more rapacious corporate colonial control over lands, including Indigenous lands. And one of the laws that they were protesting was also, the need for better laws to protect sexual assault victims, right? Because all of these things are related, obviously, like protection of Indigenous women, etc. But because it relates to Australians in terms of, will it be illegal for me to smash on holiday in Bali? These protests that were, so many people across my hometown city of Jakarta and elsewhere were framed as sex law protests. And it just shows you how obfuscating non-Indigenous media narratives are in a really dark way, obviously. But books, just read Indigenous people, but also media outlets, radio, TV, everything.
Great. I'm putting in, there's a good collection on disability studies and environmental humanities that's sort of trying to forge a eco-crip theory that can be useful, though limited to some extent by a Western colonial framework. Folks have put some other stuff in the chat, so take a look at the chat. And yes, works in translation, very important. Yeah, Karen Nakamura for sure. Another question from Angelica. Thank you so much for this amazing talk. For my question, how can young people start being involved with climate justice efforts? What are some organizations we should be aware of? And maybe ones that are engaging disability and colonialism. Any suggestions from our speakers for organizations that you think are doing the work?
So this is Jen speaking. So Indigenous Climate Action, which I mentioned earlier, I interviewed them a while back for a piece that I wrote for Truth Out. And this is where I was trying to look at the intersections of disability, indigeneity, and the climate crisis. And what I kept running into is, well, I can get an Indigenous voice or I can get a disabled voice, but I can't seem to get both, And ICA, one of the things I was asking is, are you working towards disability justice? And they actually did say that, they did a survey with some of their folks recently and found that the youth were really interested in disability and including that in the work they were doing. So, I don't know where you're located, but ICA is up in so-called Canada, but they do work down here as well. They do some good stuff. Really, the climate movement is so youth heavy. I mean, sadly, because it has to be. So I say, you know, look at what's going on around you and plug in there, because the sad reality is that there's probably some kind of environmental harm happening in your neighborhood, like where you're at now. You know, I know it's not as easy as saying, oh, just go to a protest, because not everyone's able to do that for a variety of reasons, especially right now. But there's just so many opportunities out there. You know, and what I will say too is that you may have to be the one pushing on both disability justice and, you know, ending colonialism in the climate, you know, climate crisis world and circles.
Yeah.
Yeah, you may have to do a lot of that as a youth. But just know there are others of us out here, you know, trying to push back and make it a little easier for you.
Great. And some folks have put in some other suggestions in the chat as well. Unfortunately, we have to end here because our ASL interpreter had to leave. So we're going to wrap it up. But thank you so much, all three of you, for sharing this really layered, rich work that makes these connections in such a dynamic and powerful way. Thank you so much. And thank you to the audience for sharing. Good night.
Thank you, everyone.